Andy's journey post-university was a stark contrast to his stellar academic performance. Despite being a first-class graduate in mass communication, he found himself in a frustrating cycle of rejections. No media house called him back after interviews. In his most recent interview, the sting of disappointment hit hard when the manager bluntly declared him unfit for their team. All through the entire day, Andy sat brooding in his one-bedroom apartment, thinking about his entire existence. The only thing that he was good at was teaching students. In fact, the principal of the school beside his house had talked to him about becoming their head teacher. But Andy didn't agree. He told himself that he was simply too good to be a school teacher and that he didn't go to university just to become a school teacher. But Andy later found himself in a situation that made him take the principal's offer. His longtime girlfriend and bread seller Ola got pregnant. So Andy was forced to marry her and care for their child. However, life as a broke teacher and father was difficult. Just the other day, his wife yelled at him and began to call him all sorts of names because the baby food was finished and there was nothing for the baby to eat. Out of anger, he snapped at Ola, telling her to find a solution just this once. But the curses he received from her in return were nothing to write home about. Andy was almost always scared of returning home because he didn't want his wife's trouble. But one evening, he sat in front of the house, writing his lesson plan for school the next day, when a beautiful black Jeep drove into the compound. He rose to his feet to see who it was and saw that a familiar, well-built man had come out of the car. The man rushed to the passenger's side and opened the door. Then Ola stepped out of the car looking pale and carrying her baby. The man brought out some cartons of milk and a bag of groceries from the boot of the car and dropped them in front of Andy. Andy tried to ask his wife what had happened, but she ignored him and went inside. Then Andy turned to the man and began to question him. The man told him that his wife had fainted when she came to the bakery to pick up some bread for sale that morning, and he had to rush her to the hospital immediately. The man introduced himself as the owner of the bakery and told Andy that he bought those groceries and milk for Ola and the baby. Andy began to cry like a baby as words of gratitude tumbled out of his mouth. But when the man was about to leave, Andy turned and asked him a question. "Please excuse me. Did you attend Didi State University?" The man nodded. "Mass Communication, 2001 set," the man said. "It is me, Andy," Andy exclaimed. His wife hovered at the door, watching what was happening. Obi watched him for a while and then, like a sudden switch, they shouted for joy and embraced each other like long-lost lovers. That evening, Obi didn't leave in a hurry. Instead, he stayed and ate the food that Ola prepared for them. Andy was so happy to see his friend. Then they talked. Andy discussed with Obi and told him that he needed some money to start a new business instead of relying on teaching. Andy also asked his friend to please tell him what he needed to do to be as rich as he was. But Obi told him, "My friend, the secret of my business is that I am diligent, and God is always at work. I have 7 bakeries. And I am planning on opening the 8th one next month," he said. Andy pleaded with him to make him the manager of one of his bakeries, but Obi told him not to worry. He promised to help him. Obi left that night with the promise of visiting Andy every weekend. The moment he left and Andy returned to the house, Ola began to nag. She started raining curses on Andy and went as far as telling him that if his friend was into money rituals, then he should go ahead and do the same to bring money home. But Andy ignored his nagging wife and kept dreaming about working with Obi in his new bakery. By the end of the week, Obi came around again. This time, Andy took his friend to a beer parlor beside the house to sit and talk. He asked his friend about any job openings, but Obi kept telling him that there were none at that time. However, before they departed for the night, Obi brought out some wads of cash and gave them to Andy. Andy was elated. He began to cry. What Obi didn't know was that it had been a while since Andy last counted such a huge amount of money. But strangely, Obi warned him not to use the money that night. "Let the money sleep inside your pocket tonight," Obi warned. But Andy was too blind with joy to ask him why he had given such a command. That night, by the time he returned home, Ola started to nag again. This time around, She held his shirt and began to yell at him, but Andy didn't bring out the money from his pocket. Maybe that was the secret to Obi's unending wealth. So he ignored his wife's nagging that night and slept off in the sitting room on the sofa. But something strange happened when it was exactly midnight. At midnight, Andy saw himself in a bakery. It was broad daylight, and many workers were sweating and working in the bakery. While he was standing and looking around, he saw Obi walking towards him with a whip in his hand. He told Andy to join the others to work. "Keep mixing the dough and baking bread until it's time to go," Obi said. In that dream, Andy noticed that he worked tirelessly until he was exhausted and drenched in sweat. There was a woman who was carrying a baby on her back while baking bread. Andy noticed that when the child began to cry, Obi sent some men to take the child forcefully from her mother while she was forced to continue working. They all continued to work until it was late at night. They were given no wages, and Andy noticed that they would all pass through a certain gate and give the gateman something that looked like gold. The gateman turned out to be Obi again. Andy didn't know how he got the gold, but he gave his gold to Obi and walked out of the gate. The moment he walked out of the gate, he jerked out of sleep. Andy sat up gradually and noticed that it was 10 a.m. in the morning. When he tried to get up to take his bath and rush to school, he noticed that he felt too tired to even stand on his feet. When he tried to stretch, he felt his head pounding with aches. Andy felt like he had been working for days. Nevertheless, he decided to call the school principal to inform him that he was a bit sick. But Andy noticed that the dreams kept recurring almost every day. Still, he felt that maybe it was because he was daydreaming about working with Obi. So, he ignored the dream and went about his everyday activities. Obi came the following weekend and gave him some money again for his upkeep, but then Andy noticed that the dreams persisted. This time around, he noticed that he was the only one in the bakery working tirelessly. Whenever he tried to rest, Obi would harass him and tell him to continue working. The worst part of the ordeal was that he would always wake up exhausted and unable to do his physical work. It began to affect his productivity at school. Sometimes, while he was teaching the students at school, he found himself dozing off until the students woke him up. The principal felt that he must have been going through health stress and personal issues, so he gave Andy a 2-week leave to have full rest and return to school healthy. But Andy noticed that the more he stayed at home, the more he had those strange dreams. But he always had that dream only at night. Andy realized that it was probably time to tell his friend about this strange dream and the strange bakery. So one day, Obi came around as usual, and they went to the beer parlor beside the house to talk. By the time Andy narrated his entire dream to him, Obi began to laugh. "What's funny?" Andy asked. "Nothing, but I am guessing that you have begun working as a bakery manager." He laughed again. "The truth is, maybe your dream is only preparing you on how to handle your work as a manager when the time comes," Obi said. Andy didn't quite agree with what he said, but it sounded convincing to him, so he accepted it. They talked about other things, and he went home. Meanwhile, Ola's nagging increased, especially when Obi bought a new car. But Andy didn't mind. He knew that someday soon he would make his wife happy, and she would stop nagging. He was still thinking about this one night when he fell asleep and had the same dream again. This time, there were new workers in the bakery working non-stop. By the time Andy woke up from that dream, he realized that it was 12 p.m. in the afternoon. That meant he was late for resumption because he was supposed to resume at school that day. But he wore his clothes and rushed to school with heavy eyes. He arrived at the principal's office and repeatedly apologized. However, as he was doing so, he dozed off in his chair. The principal had to pour a bowl of water on him to wake him up. When Andy realized what had happened, he burst into tears and began pleading for mercy once again. But the principal told him firmly, "You can't work here. Go and fix your spiritual problems." One day he dressed up to go in search of a job, and while he was searching for a job, he came across a familiar bakery. He stood in front of the bakery, confused and surprised at the same time. "Is this not the bakery I used to see in the dream?" Andy asked himself. Then he went closer and became friends with the gatekeeper, who kept telling him not to drop any CV with him because he wasn't sure the bakery needed workers. Why? Every bakery would need able-bodied men like me, Obi explained. But the gateman told him, look, this bakery is very different. We come early to meet the bread already baked and ready to be sold. That is why we have limited workers here. People that I don't even know come here very early to bake the bread. But you can come another day, maybe from next month, to see our boss because he traveled, the gateman concluded. Andy went home thinking about the gateman's last statement. Since he didn't meet his wife home, he branched to his neighbor's shop, Mama Risi, to tell her about all that was happening and what the gateman had said. He just couldn't keep it to himself. Mama Risi handed his child to him and told him that his wife had given her the child and had left with a big bag in a black jeep. What if your friend is a money ritualist? Mama Risi asked him. Mama Risi advised him not to spend the next money that Obi will give him. Andy laughed. It was impossible. Obi could be a fraudster but not a ritualist. But he also knew there was something wrong. There was a connection between him and that strange bakery. Just keep the money somewhere and watch to see if the dream would recur again, she continued. Andy thanked her and went into his apartment. When he tried to call Ola, she kept cutting his call. It took him 1 full week and a text message from Ola before it dawned on him that his wife had left him with their child. Andy was broken. For another week, he almost felt like committing suicide if it wasn't for Mama Risi's timely intervention. Obi finally came back from his journey, and the first point of call was Andy's house. As usual, he sympathized with his friend and gave him some money. Then he left. Mama Risi came out that night the moment Obi left and told Andy not to spend the money or keep it in his pocket. Curious to know what would happen if he didn't put the money in his pocket or spend some part of it, he did as Mama Risi instructed him to. That night, Andy noticed that he didn't have that strange dream anymore, nor did he see himself in any strange bakery. Obi came again the following week and asked if he spent the money that he gave him. Andy lied and told him that he spent the money and that he was broke. Obi again gave him some money and left, but Andy went home and joined the money with the previous one. Again, Andy noticed that he stopped having those strange dreams. And what was even more strange was the fact that a media company, which happened to be one of the biggest media companies in town, called him for an interview. He dropped the child with Mama Risi and went for the interview. To his surprise, and for the first time in his life, he was offered a job with a mouth-watering salary, an official car, and a house. Andy was ecstatic. But he wished that he could share his joy with his wife. But Ola was nowhere to be found. But Andy was determined to search for her that day. So he went back to the strange bakery again, and just as he was talking to the gateman, he saw Ola, gorgeously dressed, standing beside a familiar black jeep. Andy was about to walk into the compound to talk to her when he saw Obi walk towards her, hug, and kiss her. Andy froze with shock. It was then it dawned on him that Obi had not only tried to collect his destiny, but he also stole his wife. That night he was sad, but Mama Risi persuaded him and told him to move on. Andy took Mama Risi's advice and moved into his new house with his son. Life was good to him and his son, but he still wished that his family was complete. About 2 years later, Andy was returning home from work in one of the cars he recently bought from Germany when he ran into a terrible gridlock. It was while he was in traffic that he got thirsty and decided to call one of those hawkers to buy a drink. When he called one of them, he froze upon seeing her familiar face. It was Ola. Immediately, pain from the past rushed through his mind. He wanted to roll up his windows, but for the sake of his son, who kept reminding him of his mother, he asked her to come in. By now, Ola had already wet her face with tears. Andy found a place where they could sit and talk as soon as they were out of traffic. When they eventually did, he began to ask her why she left. I left because of my greed and because Obi promised me so many good things in life. She broke into tears. I never knew he was a ritualist, she said. Andy frowned. What do you mean? The moment I moved in with Obi, I began to see myself in a strange bakery in the dream, baking bread. Sometimes I would be all alone baking all these breads. Then, after baking these breads, I would give him some golden leaves, she said. This was the same dream I had before I got sacked from school, Andy said. The strange thing I found out was that each time I baked those breads, I would come to the bakery and see that the breads had already been baked. That's strange, but where is Obi now? Andy asked. He ran mad 2 years ago, she said. Andy couldn't close his mouth. But what would be the end of a ritualist anyway? He mused. Ola apologized to him and told him that she had learned her lessons in a very hard way. Andy forgave her, and they got back together. And they all lived happily ever after.